Today I want to show all of you a few things I like to inspect when buying a used dirt bike. Before we get into the specifics, I highly recommend that you download the free buyer's guide that goes with this video so you can easily follow along. Once you download the free buyer's guide, I'll send you additional tips that you can use when shopping for used dirt bikes. The first thing I like to look for when buying a used bike is the VIN number. If the VIN number is scratched off or altered in any way, alarm bells go off in my head and it's a sign that the bike may have been stolen. If the VIN has been tampered with, I usually walk away and look for another deal. Having the headache of having to try to piece together the bike's history and possibly owning a stolen bike aren't appealing to me. If the bike has a VIN number, ask the seller if they have any other documentation, such as a title, a previous bill of sale, or anything else that might help confirm they own the bike. Once I've confirmed the VIN is legit, I like to inspect the frame. The headstock is a good starting point. Look closely at weld joints and where gussets end for cracks. Proceed down the frame. Look for cracks and dings at the weld joints where the Y piece of the frame connects. Work your way to the back of the frame and look carefully where the lower part of the frame cradle meets up with the frame spars. Another highly stressed area of the frame is the upper shock mount. Check the welds here and look for cracks in this area. Also check the rear subframe mounts for cracks. If the bike has been looped out and landed hard on its tail, the rear subframe could easily crack at this point. On steel frame bikes, the areas you want to check are much the same. Look for cracks propagating at the weld joints in the headstock. Check at the ends of the gussets. Look around the Y piece for cracks at the weld joints. Sometimes bikes will come equipped with frame protectors. Make sure you look behind these so you can check more of the frame and the subframe mounts. Finally, inspect underneath, looking at the bottom of the frame cradle for cracks and dings. Inspect the swing arm, looking for cracks and dents. Look around the weld joints, which hold the rear axle on. Then look along the side of the swing arm for cracks that have formed. Most important, look at the front of the swing arm where the pivot axle passes through. Lastly, we'll look at the 450 for a better view of the swing arm linkage mounts. These mounts can occasionally crack as well and should be checked out. One last check I do as part of my frame inspection is line up the front end of the bike so it's positioned straight. Move to the front of the bike, positioning yourself 6 to 8 feet from the bike, and look straight on at the bike. Look carefully at the fork tubes to make sure they are not bent. Look at the wheel and see if it is straight up and down. You won't be able to spot a slightly bent headstock with this check, but you can catch major bends in the forks and headstock if you're able to spot misalignment in the front. If you come across a bike that has cracks, large dents, or bends in the frame or swing arm, I would walk away from it. Even if a damaged area of a frame or swing arm is repaired properly, the structural integrity of the part will still be compromised as the heat treatment and other material properties of the metal have been altered. With so many bikes on the market, it doesn't make sense to buy one that has major problems with two of the most critical parts. Once I've inspected the frame and swing arm, I'll do a general walk around and inspect the plastics and seat. On this bike, there are lots of good examples where the plastics can crack. Starting at the rear, the tail section is cracking, indicating the bike has flipped over backwards at some point in its life. Check that all the bolts securing the side panel are accounted for and the panel isn't cracked. The way all the stickers are coming off indicates the plastics are pretty old. On the radiator shrouds, we can see some cracking and discoloration. Look at the condition of the hardware too. See if the hardware is matching, if any of the bolts are stripped or missing. One particular spot to look at is where the plastics mount to the frame. Notice on this mount how the shroud is cracked around where the bolt fastens. Moving up to the front fender, there is some discoloration indicating it may have flexed pretty good at some point, but there's no real damage to the fender. If you look under the fender, you can see the mounting area is solid. Looking down the forks at the fork covers, we can see these are in good shape as well. Occasionally, bikes will be equipped with a brake line cover. This one happens to be missing a bolt. One last point about plastics I want to show is on the 450. Keep an eye out on the radiator shrouds for cracks where the radiators push through the shroud. This is usually caused by the bike landing on its side. One final thing I like to check is the condition of the seat. Rips and tears aren't the end of the world, but they are annoying, and if you ride in wet conditions with a ripped seat, you can expect the foam to take a long time to dry out. Damaged plastics or seat covers are by no means a deal breaker and are pretty easy to replace. Plastics are around $100 for a full set, and seat covers will run from $30 to $50. I like to check for signs indicating the bike has been raced and then talk to the seller and see what they have to say. One easy area to look at is the number plates. Numbers alone don't necessarily indicate the bike has been raced, but if you also see stickers for a race organization or sticker residue from past numbers that have been removed and changed, these might be good indicators. Next, I'll look at areas that a lot of organizations require to be safety wired. One common one is the oil filter cover bolts. Notice the hole in the bolt for safety wire. Oil fill caps are another spot, along with brake caliper bolts, the front axle nut, front axle pinch bolts, the rear axle nut, the rear brake caliper bolts, the transmission fill cap, a strap or wire which secures the kicker to the frame, the water pump coolant drain bolt, and the radiator cap. On 4 strokes, the engine oil and transmission oil drain bolts usually also get safety wired. Don't forget to check the transmission drain bolt as well on a 2-stroke. The points I've shown should give you a nice overview of spots to check and are pretty common on super motard racing bikes. The mechanical stress racing puts on an engine is high, and if the bike is not meticulously maintained throughout its racing life, the next buyer might be getting an upcoming heap of problems if they're not careful. The overall cleanliness of the bike is another thing I look at to help determine how well the seller has cared for the bike and if they might be trying to hide something. Clean bikes are a sign the bike has been taken care of, and at the very least the seller has taken the time to make the bike look presentable. I like to look for inconsistencies to help uncover problems. For example, maybe the engine is extremely clean and the rest of the bike isn't. This might indicate the engine has recently had work done on it, or perhaps they've wiped away a leak. Here's an example where the bike's been ridden and is a bit dirty. The amount of dirt around the carburetor is a point of interest for me, and I'll come back to that in a minute. While not spotless, the bike isn't excessively dirty either. Take a look at the 450. It's a clean bike all around. Notice the difference in color between the cylinder head and the cylinder. The color difference leads me to believe the original cylinder head has been replaced. Subtle clues like this can be a big help. If I were looking at buying the 450, I would definitely ask the seller what's going on with the cylinder head. Was the top end recently replaced? Did the bike break down and then get fixed, or was it replaced preventatively? If you come across a bike that is extremely dirty, I would be wary. If the seller isn't even willing to put the time and effort into making the bike presentable for sale, how can you be certain they did a good job maintaining it while they owned it? I also like to feel around the engine for warmth, which indicates the bike has been started prior to my meeting with the seller. I carefully feel around the cylinder head, cylinder, and radiators to determine if the bike has been started recently. Sometimes a warm engine will start easier than a cold one, and a seller will start a bike before you come to inspect the bike so that it starts easy for you. If the engine is warm, this may indicate the bike is starting troubles, which may require attention. If the bike has trouble starting cold, something is going on with the fueling system. On carbureted bikes, the pilot jet could be partially clogged. On a 4-stroke, the decompression system could be out of adjustment, valve clearance is out of spec, or the valves and seats could be worn and leaking. On both 2 and 4 strokes, the piston rings could be worn, making the bike hard to start, or the spark could be weak. I don't particularly like coming across a bike that has been started prior to my arrival, and it makes me suspicious. Determining whether anything is truly wrong with a bike that has been started before you arrive will take some experience and good judgment as you proceed through your examination of the bike. After I've felt the engine, I'll work my way around the engine looking for leaks. Most signs of leaks will come at the lowest point of the gasket due to the effects of gravity. Visually inspect and feel around the clutch cover gasket. Do the same for the gasket sealing the right engine cover to the crankcase. Check around the bolts with sealing washers. Inspect around the kickstart seal for leaks. Check the left side of the engine where the stator cover seals to the left crankcase. Inspect around the drain bolts. Look for signs of leaks around the base gasket. Check the cylinder head gasket as well, and don't forget to check the cylinder head cover gasket. Lastly, look and feel for leaks originating at the joint of the crankcase halves. As you look for leaks, look to see if any of the gaskets have been replaced and made from liquid gasket maker. Liquid gaskets are a cheap alternative to the correct cardboard gaskets and are a warning sign for me. The only place where a liquid gasket might be used correctly is between crankcase halves on some models, otherwise I consider them a cheap shortcut. If you find a bike with leaking crankcase halves, cylinder base gasket, or cylinder head gasket, I would be particularly wary. The amount of time and effort required to fix these problems is high, and as a buyer, these problems don't instill a lot of confidence in me that the bike has been well kept. Leaking cover gaskets are much easier to fix, and while not good, aren't too big of a problem. Checking the engine oil is one of the most important things when looking at a used 4-stroke. The engine oil level on most bikes should be checked when the bike is standing straight up. Some bikes will have a sight glass while others will have a dipstick. On the 450, there's a sight glass with a high and a low mark. Make sure the oil is at or between the marks. If it's outside the marks, you may want to question the seller about the oil level. If you're able to use a piece of paper towel to dip the oil, you can get a pretty good idea of the condition of the oil and when it was last changed. Insert a piece of paper towel through the fill cap hole and dip the end into the oil. I'm going to compare this oil sample to new and old oil so you can see the differences. New engine oil is usually light amber in color, and as it lubricates the engine, it will become darker and darker. Here's a side-by-side of the new engine oil to that of the engine oil found in the 450. Next, I'll lay down a sample of old engine oil so you can see the difference in color as oil ages. For your reference, the engine oil that came out of the Honda has about 3 hours of runtime on it. If you ever dip a bike and the oil comes out black like the third sample, the obvious question to ask is when the last time the oil was changed. On high performance dirt bike engines, keeping the engine lubricated with fresh oil is extremely important. If I see signs of neglect, such as old used up oil, I'm ready to move on and go shopping for a different bike. Lubricating an engine with old oil is hard on all the engine internals and prematurely wears parts out. I don't want to have to be the one having to pay for someone else's negligence. I'll also dip the transmission oil to see what condition it's in. The transmission oil can be more difficult to dip, especially if the fill cap is right above the clutch. To get the transmission oil onto the paper towel, I find it easiest to rotate the engine over so the clutch picks up the oil. This allows me to wipe oil off the clutch and get a sample. Transmission oil will deteriorate the same way engine oil does over time by getting darker as it is used. The color of the oil will give you a good indication of its age. Along with the color, you can also look at the metallic content of the oil. As the clutch is used, particles of aluminum from the clutch contaminate the oil. The older the transmission oil, the more aluminum particles there will be residing in the oil. While not quite as bad as coming across a bike with old engine oil, finding one with transmission oil that hasn't been changed in a long time doesn't leave me with good feelings about the seller's maintenance abilities either. Once I've checked the oil, I'll check to see how full the radiators are. This is easily done by removing the radiator cap. Look inside for coolant. In this shot, I've purposely shown you a radiator that is a little low. The coolant level should be above the level of the radiator cores. Here's a shot with the coolant above the cores. Notice how the cores are much more difficult to see. First, the bike could have spent time on its side, causing coolant to run out the overflow tube. Next, there could be a leak in one of the radiators. The bike may have a coolant leak in the cylinder head, and coolant is either being burned or pushed out the overflow tube. Last, the water pump seal may be leaking, and coolant is either leaking out the weep hole or into the transmission fluid. If you come across a bike with low coolant levels, you should be able to diagnose if the bike was tipped on its side and not refilled, or if it is indeed leaking by performing additional tests I'll cover shortly. Inspect the condition of the radiators and shrouds. Look for leaks, damage, and bends in the radiators. I'll quickly take off the shroud to give you a better view of one of the radiators. If the radiators are leaking, they will need to be replaced, and this usually costs between $100 and $200. Check the condition of coolant hoses and make sure all the hose clamps are tight. Check around the water pump cover for leaks as well. To keep on learning about testing and inspecting used dirt bikes, download our free buyer's guide by following the link provided, and we'll send you an additional 18 video tips. Good luck shopping for your next dirt bike.